In 1531, England legalized one of its most brutal execution methods, boiling alive. Not as legend, as law. This was not an ancient medieval custom from a darker age. It was a Tudor statute, written and approved under King Henry VIII, and the trigger was one poisoned household meal. A cook named Richard Roose, working in the household of Bishop John Fisher, was accused of poisoning food that killed 2 people. The shock was not only the deaths, it was the route the danger took, through a trusted household, through the kitchen, through food ordinary enough to pass without alarm. For a king under political and religious pressure, poison could look like the perfect nightmare crime. No battlefield, no raised weapon, no enemy at the gate, just a servant's hand, carrying an invisible threat. So why did Henry VIII answer one domestic poisoning by rewriting the law around poison itself? The legend gives you an image. The record gives you a mechanism. The story is often flattened into one picture, a tyrant, a cauldron, and a punishment so strange it feels like it must belong to the deep Middle Ages. But the paper trail points somewhere narrower and more disturbing. There was no long English tradition of boiling people alive for ordinary crimes. And the familiar image of oil belongs more to later imagination than to the Tudor legal record. What matters is how the punishment became lawful. To see that, follow 3 trails. First, the crime, the poisoning inside Bishop John Fisher's household, where danger entered through food, service, and trust. Then, the law, the 1531 Act for poisoning, recorded as 22, Henry VIII Chapter 9, where murder by poison was pulled into the language of high treason. And finally, the repeal, the moment the statute book itself tells us whether this was enduring tradition or something tied to Henry's reign. Henry's fear is not something we can diagnose from a portrait. It is a theory tested by what his government did, how one household crime became a national legal response. Before the statute, before the seal, before Smithfield, there was a household, and a kitchen close enough to power to frighten a king. Fisher's kitchen was not far from the centre of power, and in 1531 that mattered. By 1531, England was not yet formally broken from Rome, but pressure was visible everywhere. In court politics, church appointments, sermons, and private conversations that could suddenly become dangerous. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, but the request had become bigger than a marriage. It touched succession, legitimacy, obedience, and the authority of the Pope. To support the king was increasingly a test of loyalty. To resist him was increasingly political. John Fisher mattered because he did resist. He was Bishop of Rochester, a respected theologian, and one of Catherine's most prominent defenders. He had spoken against Henry's divorce case, and in a court measuring conscience against royal command, that made his household a place where religion and politics overlapped. A Tudor household was an institution. Servants, clerks, visitors, messengers, cooks, and dependents moved through it in layers of permission. Who entered the kitchen? Who handled bread? Who carried a dish? Who waited near the table? All of that was part of security. Poison was terrifying because it slipped through that system wearing the face of service. A dagger had to cross a room. A rebel had to raise a banner. Poison could arrive in a bowl, a cup, or a shared preparation from the kitchen, carried by someone whose presence was supposed to mean safety. So when sickness and death entered Fisher's household through food, the fear was larger than one meal. It suggested that the walls of status, piety, and rank could be bypassed from below. In the records that follow, that fear takes a name: Richard Roose. Rose was not a foreign agent caught at the city gate. He was a cook, connected to Bishop Fisher's household, the kind of person whose work depended on ordinary trust. His place in the story was inside the security system, at the point where food became trust. The poisoned preparation is described in the sources in slightly different ways: a vessel of yeast or porridge or a similar kitchen mixture used within the household. That variation matters. The file is not clean. We are working through Tudor records, legal summaries, and chronicle accounts where details can harden into legend if pressed too far. But the core facts are stark. The food was poisoned. 2 people died. One was Bennett Kerwin, associated with Fisher's household. The other was Alice Trippitt, often described as a poor woman who received food at the gate. Bishop Fisher himself did not become the fatal victim. Accounts indicate he survived, or was not the one who took the deadly portion. That detail changes the shape of the mystery. If Fisher was the intended target, the crime touched one of Henry's most visible religious opponents. If he was not, then the poisoning still proved something frightening to Tudor eyes. Anyone fed from an elite kitchen could be reached. Rose's motive remains the blank space in the file. Later writers have asked whether this was an attempted assassination, a personal grievance, a reckless act, or something manipulated by larger politics. The evidence does not prove a conspiracy, and it does not let us turn Roose into a pawn with certainty. What it does show is the reaction. Henry did not allow this to remain a household murder handled by ordinary process. The case moved upward, out of the kitchen, and toward Parliament. That movement is where the crime becomes something larger than itself. In 1531, the Roose case was answered with a statute recorded as 22 Henry V, Chapter 9, the Act for Poisoning. This was not an old custom being dusted off. It was a new legal instrument, built for a particular fear at a particular moment. The crucial change was category. Willful poisoning was no longer treated simply as murder. Under the Act, it was made high treason. That matters because treason was not just a crime against a victim, it was a crime against the order of the realm, against the king's peace, and, in Tudor practice, against royal authority itself. By moving poisoning into that category, Henry's government turned a hidden act in a household kitchen into an attack on the body politic. The statute also attached the punishment that made the law infamous, death by boiling. We do not need to dwell on the physical horror to see the message. The law joined the method of the crime to the method of punishment. Poison had entered through food, vessels, and trusted domestic labor. The state answered with a punishment built around heat, liquid, and preparation. Then came the colder move. Richard Roose was not simply sent through the ordinary path of indictment, jury trial, and verdict. He was condemned by parliamentary attainder. In plain terms, Parliament itself declared him guilty and fixed the consequences, turning legislative power into a direct route to death. That bypass is the institutional shock of the case. A murder investigation became a statute. A cook became a traitor. A household crime became a national warning. All of it moved through official forms: petitions, readings, assent, enrolled law, the royal seal. The brutality did not appear as a mob's rage or a battlefield reprisal. It appeared as administration. It was written down, authorized, and made repeatable. What makes the case so revealing is not only that Henry's England chose an extreme punishment, it is that the punishment entered history through the calm machinery of government, where a seal could turn fear into law. This is where poison stops being only a crime method and becomes a political problem. A king could surround himself with guards, doors, armed men, and ceremony. Those defenses were built for visible danger: a blade in a corridor, a rebel at a gate, an enemy on the road. Poison moved through a different architecture. It could pass by way of a kitchen, a cup, a bowl, a servant's hand, a gift of food, the ordinary routines that made a great household function. That is what made the Roose case so politically charged. It did not require an army or a public challenge to the crown. It suggested that danger could travel through trust. In the early 1530s, Henry was already ruling under mounting pressure. His attempt to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had become a constitutional and religious crisis. Men like Bishop Fisher mattered because they resisted the king's position at a moment when Henry was pushing law harder into questions of loyalty, obedience, and supremacy. We cannot open Henry's mind and prove exactly what he felt when news of the poisoning reached him. The evidence is not a confession of fear, it is timing, context, and form. A domestic poisoning answered by treason law, an uncertain motive answered by absolute punishment, an invisible offense answered with a statute designed to be seen. Read that way, the act for poisoning becomes more than a penalty, it becomes symbolic retaliation. The hidden betrayal of the kitchen is dragged into the open language of the state. The private vulnerability of a ruler is converted into public authority. This was early modern statecraft in its darkest form. Not chaos, not medieval habit, but insecurity organized into law. Once that fear had been written into the statute book, it needed a place where everyone could witness what the new law meant. The statute did not stay on parchment. It moved into London, to a place where punishment was already public language. Smithfield was not hidden. It was an open execution ground, a market space, a place where crowds could gather and authority could make itself visible. In April 1531, according to contemporary and near-contemporary accounts, Richard Roos was taken there and put to death under the new Act for poisoning. The point was not only that Roos died. Ordinary murder could already be punished by death. The point was that his death carried a different message. Poison, because it worked secretly, would be answered by the state in the most public form it could devise. That is why Smithfield matters. A kitchen crime had passed through Parliament, through the language of treason, through the royal seal, and ended in a public square. The route itself was the warning, a servant's access to food, a vessel in a bishop's household, the fear of invisible betrayal, all of it had been translated into a spectacle of royal power. And the statute did not close with Roos. In 1542, another recorded case appears. Margaret Davy, a maidservant convicted of poisoning her employer. She too was executed under the same law. Her case matters because it cuts both ways. This was not merely a punishment invented for one man and forgotten the next day, but the surviving record also does not show a long parade of such executions. It was rare, limited, and real. That rarity makes the law more revealing, not less. Henry's government had created an exceptional tool for an exceptional fear, and even if it was used sparingly, it remained available in the machinery of justice. By 1542, the timeline had stretched beyond the first panic at Fisher's household. The law had become a standing possibility. King, Parliament, statute, public death. If we look only at the cruelty of the punishment, we miss the structure behind it. Roos's case did not move from crime to trial to verdict in the ordinary way. It moved from a poisoned household to the king's alarm, to Parliament, to a statute, to a public death authorized by the highest political power in the realm. That is the real machinery, fear moving through institutions step by step. Henry did not simply rage in private and order improvised revenge. The response was written down, sealed, enacted, and placed inside the law of England. Poisoning was pulled upward from murder into high treason, a category that did more than punish killing. Treason defined the boundary between obedience and betrayal. It said that certain crimes were not just attacks on a person, but attacks on the order of the kingdom itself. In Tudor England, that boundary was being redrawn again and again. Oaths, succession, royal supremacy, religious allegiance, the law became one of the main tools for deciding what loyalty meant. The act for poisoning belongs in that world. It took a hidden domestic threat and translated it into a public language the Tudor state understood. Treason, spectacle, obedience. So the easy label, medieval barbarism, hides the more precise problem. This was not ancient chaos spilling forward into Henry's reign. It was engineered power. A specific ruler, facing a specific kind of invisible danger, used Parliament and statute to create a new legal weapon. The message to the country was not only that poisoners would suffer, it was that the king could name a fear, Parliament could harden it into law, and the state could make that law visible in the square. But if this punishment truly belonged to English tradition, it should have endured. Instead, the timeline snaps forward to 1547. The clearest clue comes at the end. In 1547, Henry VIII was dead. His young son, Edward VI, had taken the throne, and in the first year of that new reign, Parliament repealed the Act for poisoning. The citation is dry, 1 Edward VI, chapter 12, but it tells us something sharp. The punishment Henry had written into law in 1531 lasted only about 16 years. The documents give the firm ground. A poisoning in Bishop Fisher's household, an act of attainder against Richard Roos, the Statute 22, Henry V, chapter 9, rare later use, and then repeal after Henry's death. The interpretation comes from how those facts line up. A hidden crime entered a trusted household. A king in a dangerous political moment answered through parliament, treason law, and public terror. Then, once his reign ended, that legal weapon was removed. So Henry's most brutal law was not an ancient English custom surviving from some darker medieval past. It was a Tudor construction, temporary, deliberate, and tied to the anxieties of one reign. The darkest truth is not only that the state could punish with such cruelty, it is that fear, once given a seal and a statute number, could outlive the room where it began.